Hi there. I've got a number of different playlists on my channel, which you may have discovered already. Some talk about projects, cookie projects from start to finish. Others talk about sort of geeky food science. Others talk about cookie decorating techniques. This is one of those videos where I'm going to be talking about a project from start to finish, and most specifically, these 3D cookie baskets or handbags, some people say they look like, but they're great gifts, really special gifts, just one of them for Mother's Day or for a wedding or what have you. And though they might look complicated, they're actually pretty straightforward to put together. I'm going to start by showing you the pieces that went into it. Then I'm going to talk about how I cut some of those pieces. Then we're going to decorate some of the pieces. And then finally, we'll come around to putting it all together. So this is going to be a fun video. To start, let's look at what went into this project. What you'll need are two sort of half circles or 2/3 circles, ultimately fully decorated. And these will form the sides of the baskets. You'll need a cookie base. I often like to ice them in complementary colors, but you could go crazy and change out the colors and do a purple base with the blue or what have you. And then you'll need sort of 3 half or 2/3 rings that'll form the spacers between the baskets that'll allow you to have some room to put in some other cookie objects, which I've got off to the side. So that said, there are like 5 or 6 pieces that go into each cookie. How did I get them? The base is pretty straightforward. I really use no fancy cookie cutters for any of this project. I like to rely typically on things that I have without going out and getting new tools. So for this base, pretty straightforward, I used a fluted round cutter. It's from an Antico graduated set of fluted rounds. So I've got 5 or 6 different fluted rounds that come in a set. So I can always choose the size I want. It's pretty easy. These other shapes are also cut from round cutters, though not fluted. And they might be a little less obvious in terms of how I cut them. So what I'm going to do right now is bring out my cookie sheet to show you how I arrived at these shapes. Got some dough rolled out. I'm using gingerbread here. You can find these recipes on my website. But you can also use sugar cookie dough quite easily here. The way this particular project is put together, both are equally sturdy and stable and will hold up well. So I've got it rolled out maybe 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch thick. And because these shapes are going to be kind of long, and at least this one, the insert, is going to be a little bit long and convoluted, I like to roll out and cut on a silicone baking mat directly on the cookie sheet or on the silicone mat and then transfer everything cut onto the sheet. That way I don't have to pick up the cookie itself once it's cut. In the process of doing that, you can often misshape these sort of long, spindly cookies, and we don't want to do that. So this is going to make a pretty large basket, similar to the purple one that I've got here. I think this cutter's maybe, let's see, I've got a ruler right here. We can measure it, just so you all know. I think it's about 4.5 inches across, but you could go smaller or bigger, depending on how large a basket you want. So I'm cutting the round and removing the excess dough, which I always re-roll. There's no reason to waste this. And then I want to lop off an end of it, basically, just to create the flat top of the basket. And in order for the sides to match up, I'm pretty careful typically about ruling out and marking off how much I'm going to lop off. So, and I do it consistently. It doesn't really matter how much you lop off, just that you do it consistently from cookie to cookie. So let's see. I think I want to lop it off about here. And that's about 3 inches measured from the bottom of the cookie. And I like to cut with a big, large chef's knife, one straight up and down motion as opposed to dragging it, because you'll get a much cleaner edge. You won't sort of drag any cookie along with it if you were to slide the knife blade. And again, I'm pulling off the excess, and we'll re-roll that when I do other sides later on. So that's the basket side. The next thing I want to do is create the shape that's going to form this ring. I typically like to make the ring a little bit smaller than the sides so that when I'm putting it together, that ring doesn't show out, from behind the sides. So I'm moving from what did I say it was? A 4-inch cutter to cut this round here for the ring. I moved down to a 3 3/4 inch cutter. So it's just slightly smaller. So I first start by cutting a circle. Then I cut another circle out of the middle of it. I'm trying to get that circle dead center just because I tend to be obsessive compulsive about these sorts of things. And then you want to get the dough out of the middle. This is where a paring knife would be more handy than this big knife that I've got here. Or my trussing needle, because this is also handy for picking dough out of the center of something you've cut. Yeah, that's much less cumbersome. So again, all this excess dough, I would reuse. I'm going to bundle it up and reuse it for another roll of dough. Just get that out of the center if you can. And get it off the top of the ring, because if it stays on top of the ring, it'll bake there, and then you'll have an uneven surface. I think I've got enough of it out that it won't bake into the ring. And then the next thing I want to do is just lop off the top. And this shape's going to fit nicely there, as you can see. So I could actually use that as a guide to cut, but I don't really need to. I can kind of eyeball it. It's less crucial that these rings be cut to the exact same size, because again, they won't be seen. But they just do need to fit inside of the larger piece that you've already cut. So again, I want to clear this off, all the extra off, so it doesn't bake into the cookie, and so that I can reuse this dough later. And a smaller knife is easier, but that does the trick. So that's how you cut those two pieces. Standard round cutters. Again, it was an Etico graduated set, so I have a full range, in this case 10 or 12, that I can choose from to make baskets of any size. So I'm going to go ahead and bake these off. We're going to come back. I'm going to show you how I decorated the sides of these baskets, and then we'll move on to the assembly. Back in a sec. Okay, I'm back. Those cookies that I just cut out are baked, and I actually went a step further and top coated the sides of the baskets and also some of the bases for the baskets. Because the next step in putting this together is stenciling the cookies, and for that I need a top coat that's completely dry all the way through. Typically I let it dry overnight. If you want to learn more about top coating, I've got a great video on it in my video series. And by top coating I mean getting that nice smooth glassy surface. Here you see a fully top coated basket side that's been dried overnight. So that's the essential starting point. Where we want to end is something close to this. So what I've done here is I've actually, in order to get a lot of decoration on quickly, I've stenciled that pink part, and then I've gone back in and applied dots in purple and white. So I'm going to show you how I stenciled both the side and the bottom of the basket, but I'm going to be stenciling completely with pink this time. We'll start with the basket bottom, because that's an easier stencil to do. In this case, I'm using a stencil that fits the cookie base exactly, or with some room to spare, which makes a much easier task of stenciling. When we get to the basket, I'm going to be using a larger stencil, which requires a few little tricks. This is one I stenciled earlier with the dark pink icing. It's a little off center, so I'm not quite satisfied with it, so I'm going to do it again on this other pink cookie, just to give you a sense of how that works and how to get a better centered stencil on it. I've got icing of stenciling consistency. Again, this is royal icing I'm working with. I'm going to stir it up a little bit because I've had it uncovered and it looks a little crunchy. It dries out pretty quickly, so I'm going to stir it up and make sure it's smooth. Normally I choose a color that contrasts my top coat a little bit more than I have here, but I just happen to have a pink cookie here handy, so we're going to work with that. Okay, so I've got a stencil here. I do want to center it on the cookie. Typically I will do this by eye, using again my trussing needle. I'll kind of mark out the midpoint of the cookie a little bit, and that allows me to understand once I put the stencil down, what's centered. So I've marked it out. I'm going to grab my glasses because this is kind of detail work where I need to see a little more clearly. And this is a particularly easy one to stencil because I've got handling room around the edge. It fits the cookie with some room to spare. It's lying really, really flat. So hopefully it'll be an easy task. I do like to steady the stencil with my trussing needle, just so it doesn't move. That's really, really key. And the icing is relatively thick, clinging to the back of my spatula. I talk about stenciling in a lot of other videos too. I just recently shot some videos about using 2 different colors and stencils on a cookie, and we did some airbrushing with stencils. Here I'm just strictly using royal icing. So this is the easiest of easiest kinds of stenciling. Putting a little bit down just to kind of grab, make sure the stencil is fixed to the cookie, and then that didn't take much. I mean, this is a pretty small stencil. That's another reason it's easy. Cleaning off the back, and I'm going to try to do one full swipe just to get the extra icing off and to eliminate any track marks from the previous swipes. Looking pretty good from here. I'm going to lift it up. I'd like to roll it off to the side, and there you have it. My round icing wasn't perfectly round to begin with, but I do consider that stencil a little more centered So when I do finally assemble this basket, more of that stencil will show from all sides of the basket. So again, if you're really trying to locate a stencil in the middle of a cookie, it's nice to mark it off with a little tool, the center off with a little tool, so that you're not just eyeballing it. So that's the base. And that was relatively straightforward to stencil. To do the side, I'm going to use the same icing, stirring it up a little bit more because it is a little bit dry. And I'm going to clean off the blade of my spatula because I do like to start with a clean implement. If there's any dried royal icing on the back, when I come back to do another stencil, it tends to kind of get hung up. It doesn't slide really smoothly, and that is not a good thing. Okay, now back to this cookie. As a reference point, I use this stencil for it. And this was originally twice as long. It was a cake stencil designed to wrap around the sides of a cake. But I often find there's some really gorgeous cake stencils that ought to be used, or elements and parts of them can be used on cookies quite handily, provided you treat them the right way. I cut this one in half because if it's really long, there's a big piece that sort of drapes off the cookie. You can stack other cookies underneath it, like I kind of have done here to level it out. That's one trick, but I find that that cookie often kind of gets in the way. So I prefer to cut down these stencils if I can. You know, the next thing I need to decide is what portion of the stencil do I want to have appear on the cookie. And to do what I did up here, I kind of like the thought of having, you know, a peak right in the middle of the cookie as opposed to just two. I like the notion of having 3 peaks. So we're going to center it right there. Because I am stenciling with a relatively dark icing on top of the cookie, I don't want a lot of extra icing to flow out the sides because in lifting it up, that dark icing, if it touches down on the cookie at all for any period of time, that pink, it'll stain that blue icing. So what I'm going to do in this case is I am going to mask off the edges with a little bit of blue painter's tape. You can also use Glad cling wrap, but I find this works a little bit better so that I don't get a lot of overflow on the edges. And I typically do that by actually putting the stencil on the cookie and taping, not onto the cookie, but just taping off the edges so it aligns perfectly with the edge of the cookie. And I might need a couple pieces of tape to do each side to get around a curved area. So I've got that kind of masked off to the edge. The thing about painter's tape, which is kind of nice, it's not sitting on the cookie icing, so there's no worry about getting any adhesive on the cookie. But the thing that's nice about it is if I want to reuse the stencil, I can actually rinse this off and pat it dry without taking the tape off and use it over and over again for a period of time. And then when I want to remove the tape for storage purposes, which I recommend because if it sits on there too long, it's hard to get off, is I just sit it in water, let it soak, and then the tape lifts right off as opposed to pulling it off, which can bend the stencil. I prefer to soak it first. Okay, so I've got one side masked off, and we're going to do the other side next, just to prevent, again, overflow off that side, which can make a messy edge and make it hard to get a border down later. So I'm holding the stencil in place as I do that because I don't want it to shift on this side, because if I mask it off, if it shifts on that side and I mask it off on the other side, I may have masked it off in the wrong area, so it won't fit all the way across. So always I'm holding that stencil kind of in the orientation. I shouldn't say kind of, I should say exactly in the spot that I want it to be once I stencil it. Okay, so I've got that masked off. I am going to cut off all this extra tape that's around the edge because it's just going to potentially stick to something else and make it harder to pull the stencil off when I need to pull it off at the end. So we want to get all the stray tape. I've got a piece that's stuck on the top now, off into the side. And we'll do one more check to make sure that it's nicely centered. I actually think I need to come in a little bit more on this side, so we're going to adjust this a little bit so I get less overflow. And hopefully I can do this with one adjustment of this collection of tape that I pulled off the side. Yeah, that's a little bit better. Okay, there we go. Now for that last cookie I did the base, it was really, really small, and my stenciling icing was pretty thick. Which is okay. You know, I like to err on the side of it being thick because I get a crisper looking stencil. But I've got a broader area here to stencil, and I don't think that the icing is actually quite thin enough for the task at hand. So I'm going to thin this with a teeny bit of water and then come back and do the final stenciling on this. Okie doke, I've loosened up the icing just a touch. I really literally put a drop of water in there to enhance the spreadability of it over this large stencil. So same process as before, but this one's going to be a little trickier because I've got a lot more area to cover, and trying to do so with a clean swipe is always challenging. So just putting down a little bit to get coverage first, and I might smooth a little bit as I go. This side of the stencil actually looks pretty good. And I'll focus now on the side that's closest to me. And I probably won't re-smooth this area here because it's looking pretty level. If I can avoid it, I will avoid that, because as I said, this icing dries super quickly, and the more you go over it, typically the worse it starts looking. More tracks will be left. So I've got most of the gaps closed, covered, if you will, with icing. I'm going to wipe off the backside of my spatula and try to do one more swipe across the second half. I'm just going to clean the back of my stencil. It's got a lot of stuff gunked on it. So for that final swipe, that just tends to mess it up. So I'm going to clean it, and I'm going to try to go over this big track that you see in the middle and smooth that out a little bit, because that will show up. We'll go one more time that way. Maybe touch the top there. Oops. I think that looks pretty good. Now to take the stencil up, again, I like to roll it off, and there you have it. I was a little bit off center with the stencil, partly because I'm working rather than over the cookie, I'm working off to the sides. So when you're working, try to be right over the cookie, but it's a pretty darn nice and clean stencil. Otherwise, except for these areas of overflow, so I was off this edge a little bit. I could have had the stencil scooched over that edge, and then I would have had less overflow on this side. I am going to knock this off, because if it dries sticking up, it's hard to get a border around it later. So that's a basic stenciling approach that involves using one color, one stencil, and masking off a larger stencil to get just an area that you want on a cookie, which is pretty fun to do. And it provides a lot of lush detail with very, very little work. The next step to get to this point on top would be to lay dots with icing of beadwork consistency. I put purple and white dots on this. I'm going to skip that step because I talk about that a lot, beadwork that is, in my beadwork and border video, which you'll see in my video series. But I typically love to kind of embellish stencils with a little bit of hand detailing, or a lot in this case, to really dress it up. So that would be the next step. What I'm going to do is set these cookies aside, and we'll move on to the assembly of these baskets. And from here on after, we're going to be talking about how you put these things together. Okay, while that cookie that I just stenciled is drying, I'm going to work with some other cookies that have been stenciled and fully dotted and detailed and are now completely dry, and show you how to put the baskets together. It is important that you allow complete drying time after you've detailed the cookies with dots or whatever else you're putting on top of them, because you will be handling them with clean hands to some extent to put this together. And if any of the icing's wet, well then obviously you'll smudge that work that you've already done. So I've got my two sides already decorated and dried, a base, and inserts. And in the case of the baskets, you can use 2 inserts or 3. It's just a matter of how wide and chunky you want that basket to be. For the ones here on display, I have 2 inserts between them, which is just enough to slide some cookie flowers on sticks into the baskets. So I think I'm going to stick with the same 2 this time. So the basket's pretty small, or relatively small. And the next thing I like to do is to choose a front and a back, because there is a most definite front and back to this cookie construction, at least in the way I'm going to show you. So I will take my lesser of good sides, actually these both look pretty good to me, and put it in the back. Or the other thing I'll do is if one is slightly bigger than the other, then I like to put it forward so that the bigger piece, the back of the bigger piece isn't showing. But again, they're sized pretty nicely because I measured them out the way I talked about in the first step. So either one will do. I'm not going to get too picky about it. And I am going to work on bubble wrap because I do have some details here with relief, and if I work on a hard surface and move them around, I can knock some of that off if the icing has dried too much. So working on bubble wrap is always a nice thing because the back side of the cookie is going to go face down first on the bubble wrap. The next thing I want to do is glue an insert to the cookie, and by glue I mean I use my thick royal icing glue. I don't use anything inedible on these cookies. And because I'm working with gingerbread, I've matched the glue to the gingerbread color. So I've just colored it with a little bit of liquid gel brown food coloring. And it's very, very thick, you'll see. And the thicker the icing is, the faster it dries. So I can hopefully put these together pretty darn quickly without a lot of drying time in between. I always put it down in such a way that it's a little bit lower than the top of the basket so that when it's standing up, you don't see those support pieces. So it's maybe 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch off the edge, more like 1/8. And I'm going to stack another one on top, again gluing with this brown icing. And I'm dispensing it with my handy parchment cone, which focuses it in a pretty nice way without getting it all over the place. So that looks pretty good. And it doesn't matter if these inserts don't line up because they're not going to be seen from the outside. But it does matter that the next basket side lines up pretty perfectly, and especially so at the bottom of the basket because we are going to be standing it up straight. So I always, at this stage, will kind of look at the basket from the side to make sure that it's viewing properly and that as it's oriented, it's going to be standing straight up. It will almost stand on its own if I've got it properly balanced. That said, I do think I'm going to move my inserts a little bit to the right because they're a little off center, and that might cause the basket to kind of sort of list to one side. Now I'm putting on the side, again with more glue. I put that on top, but before I let it dry completely in place, I am going to set it up on the side and look at it from the side to make sure that it's standing on its own, which is great. So if you've measured those shapes really carefully to begin with, and you glue them in such a way that the bottoms are aligned, then you almost don't need to prop this thing to dry. Okay, next step. We can move forward without it being fully dry. I'm just, handling it carefully and trying not to move what I just did, is to set it on its base. If you don't want to use a base, and that's too complicated an assembly process for you, one kind of trick to displaying these is to put some sugar on a dish, fill it up so it's maybe like 1/2 inch thick, and then just simply set this in that, and the sugar acts as a support without having to put it on anything else. But I like the decorative base. And it looks like it's sitting on there pretty straight on its own without much help. But we're going to want to glue that also in place with royal icing. I try to use as little as possible so it doesn't smush out and show from the edge. So you'll see just maybe 1/2 inch length on the bottom of either side of the basket. And here I tend to continue to work on bubble wrap because if it happens to fall over, I want it to fall into something soft as opposed to my hard countertop. So I am remaining on bubble wrap. And as you'll see, it's kind of standing on its own. The other thing you want to do is look at it from the side. It is tending to lean back a little bit, so I'm going to put a little more royal icing under the back side and push this back side down a little bit so it's not leaning backwards. Look at it one more time from the front. It's looking pretty nice. And then if it is listing on you and it's not standing up straight on its own, I tend to use these dragée containers, sugar bead containers, as props. You can find other handy things in your kitchen too. And you might let that sit there 1/2 hour to an hour until that icing is completely set, and then it's more easy to fill. So for the flowers, there is one non-edible part in the basket construction. It's these craft wood sticks. I use them to glue the flowers and leaves to. And again, I'm gluing with royal icing. This is a step you might want to start earlier than the basket assembly. In fact, I'm doing it a little bit out of order because I have some that are already stuck together for purposes of putting them in the baskets today. But these require a little bit more drying time before you can pick them up and move them around than the basket itself does. So to put these together, I've just done a one-sided flower. If you wanted, you could easily sandwich another cookie on the back side with royal icing, like so, to cover up that back side so that your basket views beautifully from all sides. But for purposes of today, we're just going to do one-sided flower. And let me show you how I do that. I've got a couple of leaves already glued on a stick, so I'm simply going to do what I did here, but apply the glue instead directly to the stick and put another little flower down here. These leaves and flowers have been simply top coated and flooded. And then for the veins and some of the detailing in the center of the cookies, I used a wet on wet technique, meaning I put icings down wet, directly on wet, and then drew my little turkey lacer or trussing needle through them to create that marbled, scrolly effect. But that's covered in another video on marbling, but I just wanted to tell you that as an aside because you might be wondering how I got some of those effects. So there you have it. I've glued that on, and then I would leave this. I would slide this off to the side and continue to work on assembly of other flowers before I picked that up. Give it at least a half an hour to hour dry time before you pick it up. But you'll know. You'll lift it up and the flowers will either fall off or stick and stay on as they are with this particular one. Okay, so I've got some flowers already assembled. So I'm going to try to move ahead and just put this basket together. Okay, so I kind of like this flower. It's nice and beautiful. Now, if I were to just stick it in the stick into the basket, you know, it would flop over. So one of my handy tricks is to use a little bit of sanding sugar, colored sugar, to fill the basket. And that'll serve as an anchor for these little cookie sticks. So I'm going to fill it pretty much to the top because I don't want any of that stick to show. And I use a container that has a pour spout because otherwise this area is pretty narrow. It can't be more than a half an inch, and otherwise that sugar is going to go everywhere. Still, these sticks are 4 or 5 inches long, and given the depth of this, which is only 2 inches long, I'm going to have to trim some of the stick off in order for it not to show. And I just use scissors for this. These are pretty thin wooden sticks. I use flat sticks here. You might wonder why it's much easier to glue to flat sticks as opposed to round ones if you're not going to be sandwiching the cookies. So definitely get these. These are coffee stirrers, actually. And you can find them easily online if you can't find them in a local craft store. I'm going to trim a little bit more off. Speaking of sources, we talked about stenciling. Those stencils that I used are from designerstencils.com. I get a lot of my stencils from them because they have just a huge supply. So definitely check them out. They're all food grade stencils as well. Now, sometimes I like to hide, I'd like to hide a really tall flower, the stick of a really tall flower, behind another flower. So I wouldn't cut that down as much. But I want this arrangement to be a little bit shorter. And since I've already got a double decker flower in here, I'm just going to choose a simple one flower on a stick to fill out the other side. Okay. So I've got my flower arrangement. If you wanted another leaf in there, you could do that. I might want a leaf sticking out of the top, for instance, here. A little green in that area. So I'm going to take this one I just glued. The flower fell off because I obviously didn't give it enough time to stick on there. And I'll wipe off but the leaves were on there earlier, which is why they're staying on. And I'm going to stick it behind here just to fill that out a little bit and give it a little more depth. So that's the basic flower arrangement. And then the last touch, or one of the last touches, is the handle itself. And sometimes I put this in afterwards. Sometimes I'll put it in before I put in the other elements. And ideally, I want to choose one that actually fits inside the interior of the basket. This one's a little bit wide. So it's actually sitting on top of the cookie insert, which is fine too. It's just going to make a really tall handle. This handle, I should say a few words about it. It's made out of rolled fondant. It's not a cookie. Fondant is a chewy dough that you can roll out into thin sheets and then cut into ribbons. That's what I did here. I let this air dry to the point that I could pick it up, and then I embellished it with little royal icing dots, let those dry, and now I'm able to handle it. It's very, very delicate, but I think it adds a really nice accent to the basket without having to cut a cookie, which would be even more difficult to handle. If you want to know how I'm making these ribbons, I do have a whole another video on basic ribbon making, including handles, bows for baskets like this, little ribbon roses for embellishments on cookies. I did a series of heart cookies that used the rose on them. So we'll be getting into all of that detail in another video. For now, I just want to show you how I put this in place. So if this were sitting in the sugar, I wouldn't have to do anything. I could just slip it in place and it would stay in place. As it is, it's kind of wedged between the cookies, so it's holding its shape. And that might be fine, but just to be on the safe side, I'm going to glue the bottom down a little bit with that royal icing glue that I had. And the handle to me is a little bit long, so I'm going to see if I can trim it without breaking the fondant. The fondant is, as I said, pretty fragile, so I'm going to cut it down a little bit so it's not quite as tall. And we'll see what that looks like before I glue it in place. I think that looks good. I'm pretty careful, as always, to look at the basket from the side, from the view at which it will be presented, to make sure everything's revealing nicely. I think that looks good, and we're going to just put a little glue on the back side of the right side and a little on the front, because those are the points of contact of the ribbon that make contact with the cookie itself, and I want to glue it to the cookie. And again, I would let that dry before I move this around a lot. If you have any icing showing, which I do here, this is a place to get a trussing needle and kind of pick out any extra icing. I'm going to let that dry a little bit, and then I'm going to put one last detail on it. I have these butterflies, which were simply outlined and flooded, and then I outlined on top and did dot work on top. These are all, again, completely dry. And I just did want to demonstrate that it is possible to decorate and lean things at an angle on the front of these baskets. I have bows on the ones that you saw earlier, but I'm going to put a butterfly here and lean it at an angle. And if this icing is of the proper thickness, and I mean very, very thick, then it should sit there without falling off almost immediately. If you need to prop it, there are ways to do that too. So I put a little bit of glue on the back. Again, I try to use as little as possible so it doesn't pop out the front. And there he stays without any kind of prop or support. So that completes that basket. In another video, I talk about making a contoured basket. By that, I mean one with curvy sides. And I do that by actually baking the dough into a curve over a metal object in the oven. I'm going to talk in one video about how to put it together, and I've got a whole other video about contouring cookie dough coming up. So I'm looking forward to sharing those techniques with you. Until then, live sweetly.